All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for the University of South Florida Environment and Natural History Collection, a breakout session, Rethinking Collections to Inspire Lasting Environmental Change. Our presenters today are Sydney Jordan, the coordinator of LGBTQ plus studies for the Special Collections Department of USF Libraries. Erin Peel is the coordinator for the University of South Florida Libraries Florida Environment and Natural History Collections. And Jenna Gatley is a student assistant specialist for the EcoLiteracies for Climate Action in Florida project. And I'm going to advance my slide here. And just a few housekeeping items. We are recording the sessions. Sessions will be posted after the conference, so give us a couple weeks to get those up, and we can get out reminders to you all when things are finally up on the website. Please stay muted throughout the presentation to minimize distractions, and you can share your questions in the chat, and I will share everything at the end of the presentation with all the questions. Right. And do a brief introduction on our session today. The University of South Florida Libraries Strategic Florida Environment and Natural History Meta Collection leverages post-pandemic expectations for library pedagogy by including digital humanities tools, virtual events, and new outreach methods. They will talk about to complement trained archivists and librarians working on the collections. The Special Collections team has expanded in innovative ways to include a trained research biologist and interdisciplinary student workers. This panel will discuss 3 projects related to the broad scope of the FLENH, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, collections to illustrate how the team has collaborated to contextualize and make discoverable resources on climate change, hard science, history, intersectional activist movements, and sustainable art in a way that is approachable to users outside of the trained library science realm. At the core of these practices are library goals of encouraging an expanded patron base for special collections materials, including making the materials accessible for K-12 and university students, faculty, and the general public. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can take over.
All right, let me see if I can do this correctly. Are you seeing the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us, and Anne-Marie for moderating. So we're here today from the University of South Florida Libraries, the Tampa campus. So just as a little bit of context, USF is a public research university in a consolidated system of 3 campuses. Ours is the largest of the 3, and in total, we serve more than 50,000 students. And our special collections department's open to researchers beyond campus affiliation, and we serve all users from different ages and experience levels from research. So collecting and preserving the history and changes to Florida's environment is especially important in a state where much of our economy relies on ecotourism. And there's also an increasing need to address how extreme weather and sea level rise will impact elements of our profession and our mission as a library. And just kind of as a representative example of that, our fall semester, this past one, was interrupted twice due to hurricane-related closures. And that, of course, also threatens the security of our materials as well. So we hope you get a little bit of an idea about our collections, why this is an important initiative for us, and the different types of projects we're working on. So to take you back to the beginning a little bit, so USF Libraries was poised to launch this newest strategic collecting area, Florida Environment and Natural History, which we call FLENH, with an in-person event and a fundraising campaign. So this was in the spring of 2020, and as you can imagine, that did not go according to plan at all. But through a series of new hires, coalition building, and innovation, the initiative's undergone a lot of change and growth in quite a short period of time. And before delving too deeply into our current work, I want to discuss a little of the foundational elements of the area. So with a vast array of Florida Studies materials, our department's always been home to collections that touch on environmental narratives to some extent, through a combination of faculty publications, historic research collections, and rare books. Our Florida Studies archivists began a more concerted effort in collecting Florida Audubon materials, so ornithological materials, back in the 2010s, when that gained a lot of momentum around 2016. So I joined our department around that time and worked to process many of those early environmental research collections. And our department's gone through a lot of fluctuation over the years, including a period where there were only 3 full-time people working in our department, including myself. So that meant that most projects were very all hands on deck. And that includes really invaluable support from our student employees as well. And our department has grown tremendously over the past 2 years. We've far more than doubled our staffing. And we've also merged our unit with our digital collections team, and had a lot of new hires, some of which are very specialized, as Erin will talk about later on. And so our now curator of digital collections, Dr. Amanda Bozar, joined our team at the very end of 2019. And her professional training as a historian and a digital humanist was wonderfully opportune, because just a couple months later, we transitioned to fully remote services through across our university and as our library. So I'm sure most of us are familiar with these different cycles of hybrid instruction, different job reporting expectations, and just periods of fluctuation that completely upended traditional library practices. And for us, in-person instruction sessions for faculty members, physical exhibitions, and research consultations, they all had to move online. And each of those kind of had its different set of struggles. For maintaining and transitioning. But to stay on schedule with the launch of our FLENH initiative, Amanda and I worked to create resources online centered around the topics of air, land, and water in a centralized access point, which became our FLENH hub. And that was created through Esri ArcGIS. And so not only did this acclimate patrons to our different access points, it also gave previews of what exactly do these archival documents look like? Because a lot of people, if they've never visited before, particularly during the pandemic, at one point you couldn't visit. So this was like a stopgap opportunity for us. But it was also really important for us to centralize all of this information because in the midst of all of this, we were also undergoing a triple software migration for our finding aids, our catalog, and our digital collections. So it was a way of kind of centralizing everything, starting fresh, and then using that methodology to move across our exhibit types. And so although our patrons who research on their own time have interests across all areas, for the most part, our faculty members who bring in students for instruction sessions typically come from humanities disciplines, namely English, history, and art history. And Erin will talk a little bit more about outreach to STEM faculty and students, but kind of as a first step, we wanted to work with those traditional researchers, but infuse elements of natural history and environmental science into those existing relationships with humanities faculty. So our early efforts included a dedicated page for environmental history and a primary resource document hub we have. Again, that's hosted through ArcGIS. It overall includes more than 100 items that's used across sections in the history major's capstone course each semester. But this gave the option for them to completely focus on an environmental lens if they would choose that path. We also noticed that in general, when people come to special collections, they responded very positively to the aesthetics of botanical books. We have a lot of those in our collection. So we wanted to find new and innovative ways to make different points with those books. So for example, to capitalize on that, we integrated works for an 18th century Britain's literature class that comes in. We took botanical works and economic treatises on topics like agriculture, and we embedded those in both in-person and online learning. But we also applied different lenses so students could consider the importance of intersections between concepts like the Age of Enlightenment and scientific revolution, how that's related to global travel, European imperialism, and economics and politics of enslavement through these kind of natural history documents. Our virtual exhibits also took an angle of environmental policy because many of our patrons come to use political papers. So those range anywhere from Board of County Commission records at a very local level to US Senate records. And all of those materials have a lot related to weather, land, public health, environmental policy. And so we just were more actively highlighting that in exhibition so people could know that is a lens that they could approach in future for research. And so, although we now have dedicated subject specialists for our FLENH collection, members in our department engage with environmentalism, sustainability, and environmental justice topics across all of their own specialties. In my work with LGBTQ plus studies, instruction, activist papers, reparative metadata, and conscious editing, there's also a lot of overlap across all of those with environmental topics. So in particular, a lot of our local queer activists were engaged in intersectional liberation struggles that dealt with things like racial justice, labor rights, anti-nuclear and peace movements. And so those are all related in some way. So it's just extracting those points and teaching with it. I've also leaned more towards kind of queer ecology and the use of zines in libraries for disseminating information and reflecting on effective archiving practices. And we've also done things like the project that Jenna will speak a little bit about later. I worked on one of these story maps, Saving American Beach. It's a children's picture book, but it's about racial segregation of recreational facilities in the Jim Crow South and also Black environmentalism. So it's looking through archival records that kind of lacked contextualization and were harder to work with. A lot of folders across collections will just say African Americans, and there's not much else there. So the research process is more difficult, but it was also going back and fixing alongside me accessing those of increasing metadata and also the differences between that type of kind of backwards research process and then the accessibility of things like historic Black newspapers that are OCR'd. In our digital commons, it's a lot easier for patrons to be able to find information off the bat. So it's, taking those two approaches and making that a best practice moving forward for increased metadata. We've also done some experimental zine making at a micro level. So that is emphasizing environmental action on our own campus. And the idea with that is to kind of share these narrative aspects of environmental change and get people involved. So it's taking historical resources as well as commenting on what current student activists are working on, and hopefully that will lead to some coalition relationship building and maybe some additional acquisitions in future for archival records. And then before I hand it over to Erin, I just wanted to say a lot of what we do is quite simple in terms of communication and collaboration. And it's using different skill sets people have across the department. So as a cataloger, I try my best to accurately describe resources with subject headings that might be helpful. But as we all know, you can't put everything on a record, but it is very easy from the beginning to just kind of, I'll shoot Erin a message and say, hey, I know you're working on this exhibit. This just, passed across my desk. This might be a topic you're interested in. And that's a lot easier than doing kind of the research, starting kind of in that backwards approach. So just a little bit of being proactive and communicating with your team, knowing what people are working on. And so I'll pass it over to Erin now.
Okay, great. Now that I had all these introductions, I was gonna introduce myself again, but since I'm talking kind of from the perspective of coming into the library field without really any library experience, I wanted to give everybody kind of a general idea of the experience I do have and why that might be applicable to a collection like FLENH. So I got my bachelor's from Rice University in ecology and evolutionary biology, where I studied zooplankton predator-prey dynamics. I didn't have cute pictures of zooplankton to put up, so they don't have a section on the slide. But for my master's in marine biology, I was at Texas A&M University at Galveston, and my thesis project there studied on seal whisker sensory biology. So I looked at the innervation of seal whiskers In the top left, you can see the big mystacial whiskers. Those are the ones on the main muzzle part of the seal. So that's what I looked at for my master's, just kind of quantifying all the nerves that go to those whiskers and how they work. I've also worked as an avian field technician. The bottom left is a Bell's vireo nest. They're near threatened bird species. So for that position, I did point counts, which involves going out to a GPS point that you feel like is in the middle of nowhere. And you stand there for 10 to 15 minutes and you just listen to all of the birds around you and you write them down. That was with the Illinois Natural History Survey and the University of Illinois. I worked as a biological science technician with the National Park Service as well. And that's the bottom right photo there of me releasing some Kemp's-Ridley sea turtle hatchlings. For this job, it was basically all field work where you're driving up and down on a beach in a UTV looking for nesting female turtles. And then when you find one, you collect those eggs and you put them in a little insulator box like you see there, like a little cooler, and you bring them back to the lab so that they can hatch and raise them in an incubated safe situation, so that these eggs aren't getting predated on by ants or raccoons or what have you. Because the Kemp's-Ridleys, they're actually the most critically endangered of all sea turtles, and they only nest in a couple places. So that was on Padre Island down in Texas. As a pinniped researcher, that was with live animals, so that was kind of exciting. That's the picture of the seal wearing headphones. My entire master's project was on samples that had come from stranded animals that they had done necropsies on, or animal autopsies. So all of that was with dead animal tissue. So I actually got a 1-year research grant to go to Rostock, Germany, and I worked with seals, also looking at their sensory biology of their whiskers. And part of that is desensitizing them to certain things like wearing headphones, because they have to do that during the actual experimental procedure. So that's what I was working on with my seal there. After that, I worked as a stranding coordinator in Mississippi, where we would go out and collect all of the dead or alive sea turtles or dolphins that came up on the Mississippi beach, which is about 70 miles. So it was quite a good chunk of land to cover for only a few people, but the picture there is with me and one of the live stranded rough-toothed dolphins that we had, who now lives in Panama City. So she was actually found to be deaf and non-releasable. So we transferred her to a place in Panama City where they also actually just have a bunch of deaf rough-toothed dolphins, because that's why they strand, and so she's with her kind now. After that, I worked as the veterinary pathology technician at Busch Gardens in Tampa Bay, and I was there for 3 years, and that involves doing necropsies on any animals that die. And it's not usually something people think about when they visit zoos or whatnot, but when they die, we do investigate why the animal died and try to figure out if it's from some sort of contagious reason that we wouldn't want, them being around other animals, or to help us inform the vets in the future, like what they could do when they see these types of symptoms and what that issue might have actually been. So slide. Now I'm a FLENH coordinator. When I got the job, I actually was kind of surprised because I don't, like I just said, I don't have a lot of library experience, but how do I fit into FLENH was mainly that I do have a very broad background in ecological topics from doing my degrees and also all of that field work. I have a lot of experience with ArcGIS and environmental policies, statistics, lots of bird and vegetation surveys, animal identification. So a lot of that is stuff that I use every day when I'm working in the collections. So there is a lot of overlap, even though I don't have the library background, and that's something that I'm working on. Specifically right now, about 1/3 of our collections are bird focused. So that's been really helpful that I have a bird background It helps with a lot of identification of unlabeled bird photos. And something that ornithologists or birders do a lot when they take field notes is to use shorthand, which is kind of a struggle. So if you don't understand like alpha codes, you're not going to know which bird they're actually documenting because they only write 4 letters down. But it makes more sense in the field because you're under a time constraint and you need to document all the birds that you're hearing. Next, I think having that diverse background gives me a better understanding of the end goal and potential for real world applications. So a lot of our collections that we work with, the people that donated them or originally made that material are no longer alive potentially. And so it's good to know maybe what their end goal was or why they were collecting certain information or where they were going with this, and just kind of have a better idea of what to do for metadata and how to document something and maybe how to weed something better. And for real world applications, that it's also important for the instruction and outreach to the STEM courses, because I think what I'm going to talk about more with STEM instructors, but knowing what kind of angle to pitch courses and materials at STEM instructors to make it more relatable to real life has been really helpful. But overall, I've been really enjoying my time in the library, even though it has been a really big switch for me. But I am pursuing my MLIS degree now, so hopefully I can have the best of both worlds. Slide. So I know this is kind of a new topic of getting subject specialists into the library, and I just wanted to go over briefly my experience since I've been in there and some of the pros and cons of having scientists in the library, with the first being kind of a pro and a negative, is that scientists and researchers do understand research software and jargon, which is something that exists every day in the library field. So we understand the point of having really good metadata and having stuff documented and cited well. But this will kind of affect, especially depending on what type of subject specialist you're going to have, it's going to impact how they view and process and utilize the collections and what metadata terms they're selecting. So since our collection covers a lot of different topics, it is nice that I have a broad background. But for instance, if you have collections that are only ornithologically based, it would make sense to have someone who's a subject specialist in only birds, right? But it is tricky because we like being so detailed. But like Sydney was talking about earlier, it's also a balance of knowing who your audience is that you're trying to make metadata for, and figuring out that you can't spend like 3 hours on one metadata record sometimes because you have 10,000 other records you have to go through. So you can't be always as precise as some research scientists would normally be used to having. There's kind of a happy median. But I do think the crossover is helpful to both sides. When I was in school and getting my degrees, I don't think I ever had someone tell me, go to the library, like they're gonna help you there and they have all these resources and it'll be great. It was more like fend for yourself and like figure it out. And so I think a lot of scientists are undervaluing library resources. So having them in the library could potentially help their own research. But if you overlap with people that don't have a biology background, I think that's also helpful because they can start to realize how researchers and scientists interpret the data and what kind of values they might find most important to include in like descriptions or abstracts or metadata. The main thing that I thought was very obvious when I started was the difference between the science and the service industry, because librarians are extremely helpful people, which was really great when I was coming in without a library background, because if I had a question about literally anything, like everyone in the department was like, let me tell you why we do this and let me help you and show you. And I was like, this is amazing. But that's definitely, again, not really what I got when I was getting my degrees in a science-based topic. So I'll talk about this a little more too, but it is confusing for some professors when you reach out, I think, and you're like, we're here and we're here to help and we can help you like set up something for your class. We're gonna individually design it to fit your needs. And they're just like, you're gonna do this for free. I'm confused. Like, this isn't what they're used to. And the last 4 points about course integration, background donors, and the internal versus external mentality I'm going to go through in the other slides. So I can go forward. The first class I wanted to talk about that we had just worked with was the Conference of the Birds, which was an art class. And that was really exciting because, as Sydney said, we usually get like history or English or art history, but this was like an actual art class where they're going to be designing things. And it was based on the 12th century poem by Attar of Nishapur in Iran. And it was all about designing Japanese illuminated structures through the technique of Nebuda. And so they came into special collections. We set out a bunch of materials because the professor just wanted them to be immersed in birds. So we're like, we can do this. We have a third of the collections are all birds. And we also had vinyl records, so it's not just journals and stuff. And they actually did integrate the vocally versatile Mockingbird, which was a vinyl record that we had and we're able to digitize for them. They integrated it into their live performance piece. And the birds are now up at a museum for the summer, so they're really excited. But the main thing I wanted to hit on with this was that usually when we were looking for classes and outreach about FLENH, it was very hard science based, which we are trying to get into, but they were really excited about this and they were definitely not a hard science class. So don't just think you need to focus on per se hard sciences, like think of other applications that you could have, and those professors might be extremely receptive. Something that I remember from this class was to understand your audience. And for me, I co-taught this course with Sydney, thankfully, because she has a better humanities background. And a lot of the questions that these students had wasn't related to the actual material within FLENH. It was related to their personal interests and like the other collections that we have within special collections. So it was great to have Sydney there to also help field those questions because it wasn't necessarily on the material that I was really focused on and had the experience with and the knowledge base for. So I just had broad versus narrow approach there because I think a lot of scientists, they've been studying something for a decade or more, and they're very focused on what they know. And if it's outside of that realm, sometimes it's very uncomfortable for them. But Sydney often reminds me that you don't need to be an expert at everything, but as an information professional, you should have an idea of where to help them find this information. So that's what I'm focusing on in the future when I teach more humanities-based courses. Slide. Our main STEM course that we have been reaching out to is medical botany. And this was a connection that we made just from visiting places on campus. And so we went to the USF Herbarium because we do have a lot of botanical resources, and the director of the herbarium was there. So it was kind of really nice timing. And she was a co-teacher for this class, which talks about plants and plants products and the positive and negative effects that they have on humans or animals. And one of the main difference between the humanities class and the STEM course is the humanities was very open. They were like very much, let's put out materials, let the students get inspired. And it was the full, it was the full plan for the STEM class. They wanted like every resource we could offer. They were super excited about it. So we did do a LibGuide and a story map, which are available online. But they were also very much stressing having an in-person learning session, which we're working on developing for the fall with them right now. And I think that's because teachers are trying to get people back into remembering that there's things that aren't hybrid or like all virtual. So they wanted them to come into special collections, actually interact with material. And we also made a physical exhibit, which you can see in that bottom right picture there is just a snippet of it. But what we did for that class was, instead of having a physical exhibit that was up and focused specifically on medical botany, we came up with a kind of a 5-year plan. And the plan was to have it overlap from the tail end of the spring to the beginning of the fall. So it would be up for that period of time. So they could overlap and have their students come in both semesters to look at a physical exhibit and get exposed to different information about botanicals. But this was also really good because we could strategically pick certain topics that we wanted to cover that were also botanical related, but also related potentially to other classes that USF is teaching. So for example, this exhibit was on ecotourism, which I'll talk about more in the next slide. But overall, they were extremely receptive once they came in to see the types of materials that we had, and they were very open to suggestions. So they wanted to know what other professors had done in the past, or if there were worksheets that we usually use. So this was out of their wheelhouse, but they are really excited about the class and moving forward with it. Slide. So for ecotourism, we do have a specific ecotourism class, and Sydney and I had reached out previously to this class, and we hadn't gotten any feedback from them or anything saying that they would like to come in for an instruction session at special collections, which is why I wanted to really do an ecotourism physical exhibit first, so that we can also make it a story map and we can send that in an email, and it basically made them a whole ecotourism exhibit that also doubled for medical botany. So we were a little strategic about that, but after we did send that exhibit, we did get a response, and they actually came into special collections to see the exhibit, and we also had a exhibit survey that they actually filled out. So we did get some feedback, and this exhibit link is live. So Sydney, I think, also has links that we're going to share at the end, so we can share this with you if you're interested in seeing that online virtual exhibit. Slide. I just wanted to briefly talk about how being a scientist or a researcher can help with donor relations. And I think this mainly comes down to the fact that these are people that have been spending potentially decades doing something in science. And I think a lot of it comes down to trust and the fact that you can kind of speak the language, quote unquote, and they realize that you also come from a research background, you understand what it's like to invest years and years and years of time into something. And so interacting with these professors, I think it was more receptive because they understand that you also have your own research that you've done, and you would like to put it in good hands when you're not there anymore, and make sure that even if you're not actively researching, that the people that you're giving your materials to are going to do their best to make sure that it's properly cataloged and marketed and used as best as it can be. Slide. This last one for the collections on campus, I just wanted to briefly touch on because it wasn't a professor relationship based. This was from ECOR, the director had started. So they're in charge of the Forest Preserve Botanical Gardens and Geopark on campus. And when they started, they were just really interested in looking at the USF Greenway, because all 3 of those locations are part of the USF Greenway that runs through campus. And So I just wanted to point this out as an example of, you can reach out to people in departments that aren't necessarily teaching classes, and you can still find ways to integrate your collections into whatever they need you to do. So we're currently comparing a lot of maps and looking at how the Greenway has changed since the founding of the university. And so that's what the background there is for. Slide. And lastly, one of the main things that I had realized when I started in the libraries and we had our first in-service, I went to one of the workshops that was focusing on collections on campus, and there was a poll really between all the librarians there as to what collection within special collections they'd like to know more about. And FLENH was hands down the collection that they picked. And I thought that was really surprising to me. I was like, oh, wow, like cool. But then I also realized we've never done any outreach with the actual librarians in our library. We're just very focused on, we're doing outreach with students or faculty, or we're going to community events. But for the most part, the FLENH team, we're within special collections. So we're not in the front line facing students and potentially talking to them about our collections. So that's something that I think kind of varies between the science and the library mentality, is that the library mentality is also very aware of internal education and making sure the librarians within, you know, your department and school understand what's available and what they can talk to people about and what we have to offer. So this kind of led to our annual assessment that we're going to be trying to do, which is where we're going to be offering in-service days for librarians. So other librarians within USF can come to special collections, and we'll basically have some time to explain to them what FLENH is, so that they're better equipped to talk about it in the future and potentially offer it to other students or faculty. If they come in and they're like, hey, do you know anything about environmental material here? They can like better express what FLENH is and how to reach us and who we are and all of that. So that has, yeah, morphed into our new annual assessment, and hopefully we'll have some surveys and get some feedback. But we're excited about that, and we're hoping that's going to help with marketing and also getting the word out there about the collections more. But on that note, I will hand it over to Jenna to talk about the student perspective.
Thank you so much, Erin. So I think a really big theme that is kind of essential to this entire concept is the various backgrounds and specialties of everyone in the library. As we saw with Erin and Sydney, everyone has these different expertise or things they're bringing to the table that are really important. So I thought it would help if I just said a little bit about myself and where I came from before I came into the project I'm working on, LCAF, which I'll talk more about, and just the library in general. So I think I've been working at the library a year and a half now, maybe close to 2 years, something like that. But before that, I had more of a humanities and digital background, where it went from, I worked on a lot of coding projects. I've worked just in the English department and on more like humanities-based projects. And so when it came to things like starting in the library and seeing cataloging metadata and all these really important background things that need to be done to get research even jump-started for humanities or even science-based work, I kind of had like a culture shock, like, whoa, there's so much that I didn't know about, or maybe didn't think I was prepared for, like I had the specific qualifications. But the entire point of it is it's important to consider your specialty as the key perspective qualification for the work you're going to be doing. So while I may not have come in to the library with extensive library background or experience, I did have things that were helpful. So my time working on different like digital projects where I worked on using key terms and digitizing works, were able to translate well into this environmental project I'm working on now, the same way that Erin's scientific specialty has really advanced the FLENH and special collections overall. So I think that's kind of the main point I definitely want to get across before I go into more detail, is that different backgrounds and like just collaboration in general is so essential to the growth of each individual person's project, but also just how well the library functions as a whole, because we really do collaborate a lot. Like I've talked with so many people in different departments, and I'll just like learn more about what they're working on and be like, did you see this cool thing? I'm going to share it to you. Cool example is on the screen. I've included a lot of my favorite artifacts I've come across. And for most of these, I'll either send them to somebody. I'm like, oh, this is cool. Maybe you'll like this or could find use in it. Or I've had them sent to me, especially with like the manatees guide. I think I found that through FLENH, and estuaries I came across while going through just some different boxes. And so there's a lot of crossover. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that different, talents are really so essential, even though it is intimidating to step into this, library world without the exact qualifications you may think you need. So when it comes to my work with environmental librarianship in general, it kind of started when I joined the USF Special Collections as a student assistant specialist with LCAF. And so I'll kind of just give you a brief description of what LCAF is. So LCAF stands for EcoLiteracies for Climate Action in Florida. And it is essentially currently this project working to provide resources and basically a starting step for teachers and other educators to learn more about environment, eco-justice, and different local engagement with it. And so I started working on it with digitization and helping make story maps, helping find resources, and organizing basically the content that's going to be on the website. And so for me, someone who is used to working with maybe the more digital side of things, but not the more research side, I was like, whoa, how am I going to like bring my skill set to this and make it work? But it was a really good kind of adventure, I'd suppose, to learn about all the different ways to take what I did know how to do, which was make Excel sheets and just search for different things. And I started to learn more about the environment, and it has shaped me a lot and turned me into an environmental nut now that I'm really like in love with this field. And I'm actually going to be, I've completed my bachelor's in English, and I'll be pursuing my master's in library and information sciences up at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I will be working with the EPA, which is the, Environmental Protection Agency. And so I think kind of like in short, it's good to see that each interaction has kind of led me down a path of more experience, one with librarianship and science in general. But I started with really basic like humanities background. I knew how to do some basic code and organization with like the digital side of things, but I joined in with the USF Special Collections, and it was just such an embracing environment where I started to really gain a lot of skills and collaborate and kind of grow into this new set of specialties now, because I can say, oh, I've worked on story maps. I've seen how these collections are formed and just build. So I think it's really essential to consider this new perspective for the student side of things, because a lot of projects could truly benefit a lot with more inclusion of different specialties, but also students who can come and grow alongside the project and help build it. So I think that's a really important point I want to touch on, is just kind of how involving students not depending on their background would be a really, really essential step. And you'll find that you'll have a lot of new insights come into play. So I think that's a pretty essential thing. And I'm definitely very thankful for my time at the USF Library. And I found that I didn't need to be an expert in librarianship, but I've come to grow my skill set a lot with it. But so LCAF itself has definitely touched on interdisciplinary fields. So it talks about different resources to use for teachers on climate action, eco-literacies, and different stances to take on it. And so it's kind of like the perfect example too of an interdisciplinary resource. And I'm sure Sydney will provide a link for it too once we finish up. But I just wanted to give my own perspective on it. I think that's all I have. In case you want to wrap up, Sydney.
I think you might be muted, not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I have a separate mute on the microphone that's not the one on the computer, so it was thwarting me. But yeah, I was just saying that we did link all of the resources that we've included here, and it has examples. We have our FLENH portal. I've included Erin's LibGuide as well as our LCAF portal that Jenna and I both worked on, as well as links to just our digital collections and archival collections. And we have what we try and do throughout our like virtual courses and exhibits. Those are on a lot of different topics, but to the best of our ability, even though we have all of these strategic collecting areas, we try and include as much as we can with that cross intersection and interdisciplinary, mindset to them. To, like Erin said, it's not just FLENH doesn't only apply to hard science students, and some of that's through trial and error, and you learn different ways, and sometimes you have to adapt when a professor comes and says, oh, I'm interested in this, do you have anything? Sometimes you get creative, and it actually changes your perspective on how you work on collections. So we just have all of those links to share, and if anyone has questions, we're happy to answer those.